The rain fell in gray, relentless sheets against the windows of the corner booth diner, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of smeared headlights and hurried shadows. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old coffee, frying bacon, and damp wool. For Arthur Callahan, it was a familiar trinity of scents, a kind of mundane perfume he had come to associate with his quiet, solitary life. He sat alone in a cracked red vinyl booth, a large man made larger by the faded, patchless leather vest he wore over a simple gray thermal. His beard was a wild, untamed thing, streaked with silver, and his hands, resting on either side of a heavy ceramic mug, were a roadmap of scars and calluses. He was an island in the small sea of the diner. A family in the next booth over, with 2 young children, had shifted their table an inch away from his when they sat down. The father, a man in a crisp polo shirt, cast nervous glances his way, while the mother subtly shielded her son's view with a menu. Arthur felt their judgment like a change in air pressure. He was used to it. In a world of clean lines and curated appearances, he was a smudge, a relic of a harder, dirtier time. He didn't mind. Silence was a currency he had learned to value. He took a slow sip of his black coffee, the bitter heat a welcome distraction. The bell over the diner door chimed violently, announcing an arrival that was less an entrance and more of an invasion. A teenage girl, maybe 16, stumbled in, her face pale and streaked with rain and tears. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. Her eyes, wide with a terror that was raw and absolute, darted around the room. They skipped over the family, the 2 old men arguing over a newspaper at the counter, the weary-looking waitress wiping down a table. They were all part of the normal world, a world that had just failed her. Then her eyes landed on Arthur. He saw the flicker of calculation in her gaze. She wasn't seeing a man. She was seeing a fortress, a wall, a shadow large enough to disappear into. Without a word, she scrambled across the checkered linoleum floor and slid into the booth opposite him, pressing herself against the cold vinyl, her body trembling like a frightened bird. The diner, which had been humming with low conversation and the clatter of cutlery, fell into a sudden, profound silence. Every eye was on them. The whispers started immediately, venomous and certain. "What is he doing with a girl that young?" A woman at the counter muttered to her friend, loud enough to carry. The polo shirt father pulled his children even closer, his face a mask of stern disapproval. Arthur didn't move. He didn't look at the girl. He kept his gaze fixed on the black swirls in his coffee cup, his posture unchanged. He could feel her fear, a frantic, palpable energy radiating across the small table. He didn't need to know her story. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of the hunted, and he had promised himself a long time ago that he would always stand for the hunted. So he sat, a silent, unmoving mountain, and became her shield. The bell chimed again, this time with a sharp, arrogant clang. A young man stood in the doorway, shaking the rain from his expensive-looking jacket. He was handsome in the way of a magazine advertisement. Perfectly coiffed hair, a chiseled jaw, clothes that cost more than Arthur's monthly rent. But his eyes were cold, flat chips of ice. He scanned the room, his proprietary gaze sweeping past the other patrons until it locked onto the girl huddled in Arthur's booth. A predatory smile touched his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He strode toward them, his loafers making confident, rhythmic clicks on the floor. "Maya, honey," he said, his voice a slick, condescending purr. "There you are. Silly girl, running out in the rain like that. Let's go. Don't make a scene." He didn't even acknowledge Arthur's presence, treating him as if he were a piece of furniture, an inanimate part of the booth. The girl, Maya, shrank further behind Arthur, her trembling growing more violent. "No, Kyle," she whispered, her voice so faint it was barely audible. "Leave me alone." Kyle's smile tightened. For the first time, he deigned to look at Arthur. His eyes raked over the worn leather, the wild beard, the scarred hands. A look of profound disgust crossed his features. "What's this?" he sneered, his voice dripping with derision. You trade down for a pet grizzly bear? Seriously. He gestured dismissively at Arthur. Come on, Grandpa, time for your nap. The adults need to talk. Arthur remained silent, his expression unchanging. He didn't look up from his coffee. This infuriated Kyle, who was accustomed to being the center of every room, the focus of all attention. His power was built on intimidation and the assumption of his own superiority. Arthur's utter indifference was a direct challenge to that. Did you hear me, you old hobo? Kyle snapped, his voice rising. I'm talking to you. Get out of the way. He reached across the table, his hand clamping around Maya's wrist like a vice. She let out a small, sharp cry of pain. The sound pierced the diner's tense silence. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably. Sal, the owner, nervously polished an already gleaming glass behind the counter. The waitress, Brenda, edged toward the kitchen, her eyes wide. They were all witnesses, but their silence was a form of consent, a quiet vote in favor of the clean-cut boy over the intimidating biker. Arthur felt their collective judgment settle on his shoulders, a familiar weight. He didn't move to stop Kyle's hand. Not yet. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, placed his own large hand flat on the tabletop, right beside his coffee mug. It was not a threat. It was a statement, a line being drawn. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it anchored the space, claiming it. Said, I am here. This ground is taken. The air crackled, thick with unspoken violence, and Arthur Callahan, a man who had made a long and painful peace with stillness, simply waited. As Kyle's voice, sharp and grating, filled the small space of the booth, Arthur's mind didn't drift so much as it settled. The present moment, with its cheap coffee and rising tension, became a thin veneer over a deeper, more resonant past. The boy's arrogant posturing was a pale echo of other confrontations, other bullies who mistook silence for weakness. Arthur's stillness wasn't passive. It was forged in the crucible of absolute chaos, a discipline learned where a single flinch could mean the difference between life and death. His thoughts weren't a narrative but a collage of sensory fragments. The grit of sand in his teeth so fine it felt like ground glass. The oppressive, shimmering heat rising from the hood of a Humvee in the Kandahar province. The high-pitched whine of an engine pushed to its limit, a sound that was forever tangled with the metallic scent of fear. He remembered the weight of his gear, the comforting pressure of the rifle stock against his shoulder, the easy camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their last breath. Men like Davy Rostova. He'd been a kid, really, barely 20, with a goofy grin and a picture of his 17-year-old sister, Maya, taped to the inside of his helmet. Not this Maya, but another one. A girl with the same wide, frightened eyes he saw across the table now. You gotta look out for her if something happens to me, Sarge, Davy had said one night, the words whispered under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed unreal. She's all I've got. Arthur had clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture feeling heavy, sacramental. Nothing's going to happen to you, kid. But I promise. It was a promise he had failed to keep. The IED had turned their world into a storm of fire and shrapnel. Arthur had woken up in a field hospital in Germany with a leg full of metal and a void where his friend used to be. He had written a letter to Davy's sister, a clumsy, inadequate string of words that felt like ashes in his mouth. She never wrote back. He didn't blame her. What could he possibly have said to mend a world so brutally broken? That failure had hollowed out a space inside him, a quiet, cavernous chamber where promises went to die. He had spent the years since trying to honor the ghost of that vow, not with words, but with action. He sought out the vulnerable, the overlooked, the one society had written off. He stood for them because he hadn't been able to stand for her. He had learned his most valuable lessons in that dusty, war-torn land. He learned that true strength wasn't in the roar, but in the resolve. It was in the steady hand of a medic working under fire, the unwavering gaze of a sentry on a long watch, the quiet courage of a man holding his ground. The loudest man in the room was always the most afraid, his volume a desperate attempt to drown out his own insecurity. Kyle, with his polished shoes and his raised voice, was screaming his fear to the whole diner. Arthur saw him not as a threat, but as a frightened boy playing a dangerous game. The scars that webbed the backs of his hands weren't from cheap brawls. They were from tearing at twisted metal, from pulling a driver from the burning wreck of a civilian vehicle that had strayed too close to a firefight. The limp he tried to conceal wasn't a product of age but a permanent reminder of the cost of keeping a different kind of promise. He looked at the girl, this Maya, huddled and trembling, and the two Mayas merged in his mind. The promise to Davy echoed in that hollow space inside him. This time he would not fail. He would be the wall. He would be the shield. And he would do it his way, with a silence that was louder and more powerful than any shout. Kyle's frustration mounted, curdling his handsome features into an ugly mask of rage. Arthur's resolute silence was a mirror, reflecting Kyle's own powerlessness back at him, and he couldn't stand the image. "What, are you deaf?" he snarled, leaning closer, his voice a low, menacing hiss that carried through the diner. "Or just stupid? Look at you. You're a pathetic joke. A washed-up old man trying to play hero for a girl who's way out of your league." He was fishing, casting out insults like lures, desperate for a bite, for any reaction that would validate his dominance. The diner patrons were a captive audience, their initial murmurs having died down into a thick, watchful silence. They were statues in a tableau of civic cowardice. The father in the polo shirt had turned his back completely, creating a physical barrier between his family and the unfolding drama, as if not seeing it would absolve him of his inaction. Sal, the owner, was now meticulously arranging sugar packets in a chrome dispenser, his focus so intense it was clearly a performance. He didn't want his diner smashed up. He didn't want the police. He just wanted it all to go away. Brenda, the waitress, had vanished into the kitchen, the swinging door flapping shut behind her. Their collective inaction was a cushion for Kyle's cruelty, absorbing the impact and allowing him to escalate without consequence. They had already passed judgment. In their eyes, Arthur was the interloper, the unknown variable, the probable source of the trouble. Kyle, despite his behavior, was one of them. Familiar, clean, predictable. Arthur absorbed the verbal blows without a flicker of expression. Each insult washed over him and he let it go. He had been called worse by better men. He was anchored in his purpose, his entire being focused on the small, trembling girl across from him. He could feel her fear as a physical presence, a cold spot in the warm diner air. He heard the slight catch in her breathing, the rustle of her jacket as she tried to make herself smaller. His resolve hardened. He was a dam holding back a flood, and he would not break. Seeing his words fail, Kyle's rage spilled over into physical action. With a sudden, violent shove, he slammed his hands against the edge of the table. The heavy Formica top jolted forward, ramming into Arthur's midsection. The thick ceramic mug of coffee tipped, sending a wave of scalding black liquid cascading over Arthur's hand and wrist. The pain was sharp, electric, but his face remained a stony mask. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply watched the dark liquid drip from his fingers onto the floor. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for a paper napkin from the dispenser. He calmly wiped the hot coffee from his skin, his movements measured and economical. The lack of reaction seemed to unhinge Kyle completely. It was the ultimate denial of his power. He couldn't provoke, he couldn't intimidate, he couldn't even elicit a cry of pain. Arthur's stoicism had stripped him of all his weapons. In his fury, Kyle made his final, critical error. He lunged across the table again, his face contorted. "You're coming with me now, Maya," he roared, his fingers digging brutally into the soft flesh of her upper arm. Maya cried out, a sharp, piercing sound of genuine pain and terror. That was the line. That was the sound that broke the stillness. Arthur moved. It wasn't the explosive, lightning-fast motion of a movie hero. It was the deliberate, unstoppable movement of a tectonic plate. He rose from the booth, unfolding to his full, considerable height. He seemed to suck all the air out of the diner, his sheer mass a sudden and overwhelming presence. He didn't reach for Kyle. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stepped forward, placing his body squarely between the boy and the girl, creating a living wall of leather and resolve. His shadow fell over Kyle, eclipsing him. For the very first time since the ordeal began, Arthur spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a profound and undeniable gravity that cut through the tension and silenced every other sound in the room. The lady said no. The 5 words hung in the air, simple, clear, and absolute. They were not a suggestion. They were a verdict. Kyle, momentarily stunned by this sudden, quiet assertion of power, reacted with pure, unthinking rage. He balled his fist and shoved Arthur, hard, in the center of his chest. "Get out of my way, you old freak!" he screamed. The shove was powerful, fueled by adrenaline and spoiled entitlement. It sent Arthur stumbling backward. For a moment, his bad leg, the one full of Kandahar steel, buckled under the unexpected force. He winced, a flicker of pain finally breaking through his stoic facade, and caught his balance on the edge of the main counter, his hip knocking over a tall glass sugar dispenser. It shattered on the floor, the explosion of sound making everyone jump. The crash was a punctuation mark on the scene. But Arthur didn't fall, and he didn't fight back. He pushed himself upright, his jaw tight against the throbbing in his leg, and resumed his position. He stood his ground, a guardian who refused to be moved, a protector who would absorb any punishment to shield the one behind him. He was taking it all, the insults, the coffee, the physical assault, and in doing so, he was winning a battle Kyle didn't even understand he was fighting. The battle for dignity. The shattering of the sugar dispenser was like the breaking of a spell. The sound, sharp and final, jolted the onlookers from their passive stupor. They had seen it all now, laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light of the diner. They saw Kyle's vicious shove. They saw Arthur, a man twice Kyle's size, stumble and nearly fall. They saw the flash of pain on his face as his leg gave way. And most importantly, they saw his profound, almost saintly restraint. He had not raised a hand. He had not uttered a threat. He had simply stood, a bulwark of quiet strength. The carefully constructed narrative in their minds, the one with the dangerous, unpredictable biker and the clean-cut, respectable young man, crumbled into dust. The truth was now undeniable. The monster in the room wasn't the one with the beard and the leather vest. The father in the polo shirt, who had so pointedly ignored the confrontation, slowly turned around. He looked at Arthur, then at Kyle, and the judgment in his eyes had been replaced by a dawning sense of shame. He leaned over to his wife and murmured, his voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet. He didn't even touch him. The kid shoved him, and he didn't do a thing. His wife nodded, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes fixed on Arthur with a new, uncertain respect. Behind the counter, Sal the owner stopped his pretense of cleaning. He let the rag drop from his hand and stared at the broken glass on the floor, then at Arthur, who stood unflinching despite the obvious pain in his leg. Sal had run this diner for 30 years. He'd seen his share of tough guys, loudmouths, and bullies. He knew the difference between a man who postured and a man who possessed genuine strength. What he was seeing in Arthur was a kind of control, a level of discipline he had rarely witnessed. It was the strength of a man who had nothing to prove. Brenda the waitress reappeared from the kitchen, a cordless phone clutched in her hand. She had gone to call the police, but now she hesitated. Her gaze flickered between Kyle's contorted, furious face and Arthur's calm, resolute back. Who was the victim here? Who was the aggressor? The answer, which had seemed so clear just minutes before, was now impossibly complicated. Kyle sensed the shift. The atmosphere in the diner had changed. The silent complicity that had fueled his arrogance was gone, replaced by a current of disapproval. He looked around the room, seeking the familiar deference he commanded, but found only cold stares and averted eyes. His power, derived entirely from perception and intimidation, was evaporating under the weight of Arthur's quiet dignity. He was exposed, his cruelty laid bare for all to see. He was no longer the protagonist in a romantic drama. He was just a thug in a nice jacket, and the entire room knew it. The silence that now surrounded him was no longer passive. It was condemning. Just as the weight of that condemnation began to settle, a new sound intruded. It started as a low, almost subsonic hum, a vibration felt more than heard, trembling up through the soles of their shoes. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. It was not the sound of a single engine, but of many, a chorus of controlled power, a mechanical growl that promised something immense and unstoppable. Every head in the diner turned toward the rain-streaked front windows. Through the rivulets of water, they saw them. Motorcycles. One, then five, then a dozen, then more, pulling into the diner's small parking lot with practiced, disciplined precision. They were not the sport bikes of joyriding teenagers. These were heavy, powerful machines, Harleys, Indians, gleaming with chrome and dark paint, even in the dim, rainy light. The riders dismounted in near unison, a fluid, coordinated movement. They were all large men, clad in heavy, road-worn leather. And on the back of every vest was the same three-piece patch. A snarling wolf's head, framed by a top rocker that read Hell's Hounds and a bottom rocker that named their territory. The diner door swung open, and the world outside seemed to rush in. The smell of rain, wet leather, and gasoline. The lead biker stepped inside. He was older than the rest, his face a leathery roadmap of sun and wind and hard miles. A long, graying braid hung over his shoulder. He was followed by his brothers, who filed in behind him, their boots heavy on the linoleum. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their sheer presence was a declaration. They filled the doorway, blocking the fading afternoon light, their collective size and stillness creating an immediate, suffocating pressure in the small room. The fear in the diner shifted its target. The vague unease caused by a single quiet biker was nothing compared to the primal, gut-level intimidation of 24. But they weren't looking for trouble. Their eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the room, taking in the scene with a practiced economy of movement. They saw the shattered glass on the floor. They saw the terrified girl. They saw the snarling, cornered-looking boy. And then they saw Arthur standing sentinel. The leader's gaze settled on Arthur. A flicker of recognition, of understanding, passed between them. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a sign of acknowledgement, of solidarity. The bikers didn't move forward. They didn't need to issue a threat. They simply stood, a silent, leather-clad phalanx, their presence transforming the diner into their domain. Their message was as clear as the snarling wolf on their backs. They were here for one of their own. The leader, the man with the gray braid, began to walk forward, his boots making a slow, deliberate cadence on the floor. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never had to rush a day in his life. He completely ignored Kyle, his eyes fixed on Arthur as he closed the distance. The other bikers remained by the door, a formidable wall of silent witnesses. "Art," the leader said, his voice a low rumble, perfectly matching the sound of his bike's engine. "Figured we'd find you here. You missed the turn for the meet. We got worried when you didn't answer your phone." Arthur gave a slight, weary nod. "Got held up, Preacher." Preacher's eyes finally shifted, moving from Arthur's stoic face to Kyle's pale, sweating one. He looked at the boy's hand, still gripping Maya's arm. Then he looked around the diner, at the fearful, curious faces of the patrons. He seemed to understand the entire situation in a single, sweeping glance. He drew himself up, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer casual. It carried the weight of a sermon delivered from a pulpit of steel and leather. "You people," he began, his voice not loud but resonant, compelling every person to listen. "You look at my brother Art here and I know what you see. You see the beard, the vest, the size. You see a threat. You see trouble." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting the patrons feel the sting of their own prejudice. "Let me tell you who you're really looking at." He raised a gloved hand and pointed a single, steady finger at Arthur. "You're looking at Sergeant Arthur Callahan." United States Army, retired. A man who spent 10 years in the worst places on earth, so you could sit here in peace and complain about your coffee being too cold. A hush fell over the diner. The father in the polo shirt flinched as if struck. I know what he is, Preacher continued, his voice hardening. Because he's the reason my own son is alive today. We were in the same unit. I was stateside, waiting for news, praying. Art was there. Kandahar. Their convoy hit a daisy-chain IED. Art's vehicle was thrown 50 feet. He had a broken arm and his leg was ripped open by shrapnel. But he didn't wait for medics. Preacher's gaze was now fixed on the middle distance, seeing a memory as clear as the diner around him. While the bullets were still flying, he crawled back to the burning Humvee. He pulled his driver out. Then he went back in for the gunner. Then he went back a third time through the flames and the ammo cooking off inside, and he dragged my boy, my Johnny, to safety just seconds before the whole thing blew. 3 men. He saved 3 men while he was bleeding out in the sand. He turned his cold, hard eyes back to the diner patrons. They tried to give him a silver star for it. He turned it down, said he was just doing his job, said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. He carries those men with him every single day. That limp he has, that's not old age. That's his reminder of the price of brotherhood. He finally looked directly at Kyle. His eyes filled with a contempt so pure it was almost a physical force. This man doesn't wear our patch because he says he hasn't earned the right to. He says he hasn't bled with us. But he is more of a brother to every single man in this room than you will ever be to anyone. He's a protector. It's in his bones. It's all he knows how to be. The story settled over the room, thick and heavy as smoke, changing the very air they breathed. Kyle's face had gone from pale to ashen. The washed-up loser he had been tormenting was a decorated war hero. The hobo was a man of profound, tested courage. The patrons looked from Preacher to Arthur, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and a deep, burgeoning respect. The entire dynamic of the room, of their town, of their quiet little world, had been irrevocably, seismically altered. With the truth of Arthur's past laid bare, the atmosphere in the diner transformed. The silence was no longer tense or judgmental. It was thick with reverence. Preacher reached up to his own vest, his movements slow and deliberate. He unfastened a small, intricately carved metal pin from the worn leather over his heart. It was a wolf's head, cast in pewter, small and understated. It wasn't a club patch or a rank insignia. It was something older, more personal, a mark of profound respect, given only to those who had demonstrated the highest form of loyalty and courage in the eyes of the Hell's Hounds. He stepped forward and, with a solemnity that felt like a formal ceremony, pinned the silver wolf onto the empty space on Arthur's plain vest. You earned this a long time ago, brother, Preacher said, his voice low and full of emotion. It's time you wore it. The other bikers, standing silent by the door, gave a collective, rumbling murmur of approval. It was their version of a salute. The community, shamed into action, began its own quiet atonement. Sal, the owner, emerged from behind the counter, his face etched with a deep, newfound respect. He carried a fresh, steaming mug of coffee and a large slice of apple pie, still warm from the oven. He set them down on the table in front of Arthur. This is on the house, Sergeant, Sal said, his voice thick. For you and for your friends. Anything you need. For as long as you're here, it's on the house. Brenda the waitress, her eyes shining with unshed tears, came over to Maya. She placed a glass of water on the table and rested a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder. Are you okay, honey? She asked softly, her voice gentle. It was the first gesture of kindness Maya had received from anyone other than Arthur. Even the father from the neighboring booth felt compelled to act. He walked over to Arthur's table, his posture humbled, his gaze direct. He pulled a crisp $20 bill from his wallet and laid it on the table. This is for your coffee, he said, his voice quiet but clear. He met Arthur's eyes. And thank you for your service. Now all that was left was the matter of Kyle. Preacher turned to him, his face impassive but his eyes like chips of flint. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was absolute. "Get out," he said, the words simple and final. "You will leave this town. You will never contact this young lady again. You will not call her, you will not text her, and you will not come within 100 miles of her. We'll know if you do." Two of the largest hounds detached themselves from the group by the door and moved to flank Kyle, their massive forms boxing him in. They didn't touch him. Their presence alone was an iron cage. Kyle, utterly broken and stripped of his arrogance, looked like a child. He nodded frantically, unable to speak. He scrambled out of the booth and practically ran from the diner, the two bikers following him out into the rain to ensure he kept going. The rest of the hounds watched him go, their expressions unreadable. Justice had been served, not with fists, but with the crushing weight of truth and honor. The bikers then dispersed, some taking booths, others leaning against the counter, their quiet presence transforming the diner from a place of conflict into a sanctuary. Arthur finally sank back into the vinyl seat, the exhaustion of the last hour settling deep into his bones. His bad leg throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a familiar companion. He looked down at the small pewter wolf pinned to his vest. He hadn't asked for it, hadn't sought any recognition, but the weight of it on his chest felt right, felt like a homecoming. Maya, no longer trembling, looked across the table at him. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a profound, tearful gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying all the weight of her ordeal. "He wouldn't stop. I didn't know what to do." Arthur simply nodded, the gesture conveying an understanding that words could not. He picked up the fresh mug of coffee Sal had brought him and took a long, slow sip. The warmth spread through him, chasing away some of the chill. Preacher slid into the booth opposite him, where Maya had been sitting. He pushed the slice of apple pie closer to Arthur. "Eat," he commanded gently. "You look like hell." They didn't speak of the confrontation again. There was no need. Instead, they fell into the easy, comfortable rhythm of old friends, talking about bikes, about the miserable weather, about a brother up in Oregon who had just finished rebuilding a vintage panhead. Their conversation was a quiet stream flowing around the rock of their shared history, a testament to a bond forged in fire and noise, now expressed in peace and quiet. The diner and its patrons had been fundamentally changed. They watched the scene not with fear, but with a quiet sense of wonder. They saw the bikers not as an invading force, but as a loyal guard. They saw Arthur not as a frightening outsider, but as a pillar of their community they had never even known they had. The family with the two children was still there, but now the father was quietly explaining to his son what a hero was, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Arthur's booth. As the rain finally subsided and the last rays of the setting sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet asphalt in hues of orange and gold, the Hell's Hounds began to stir. They had already made arrangements for Maya, calling a female friend of the club who lived nearby to come and take the girl safely home. They were protectors, and their protection was thorough. When Arthur stood to leave, leaning just slightly on Preacher for support, a strange and beautiful thing happened. Sal came out from behind the counter. Brenda emerged from the kitchen. The family stood up from their booth. The two old men at the counter turned on their stools. One by one, the people in the corner booth got to their feet. No one spoke. No one applauded. They simply stood in a silent, collective tribute. It was a standing ovation of the heart, a quiet, profound apology and a promise of respect earned and freely given. Outside, the air was clean and cool. The engines of 24 motorcycles roared to life, a thunderous symphony of loyalty. The sound no longer held any menace. It was the sound of brotherhood, a promise of sanctuary. Arthur swung his leg over his own bike, an older, less polished machine that looked as weathered and resilient as he did. He was in the center of the pack now, surrounded by his brothers. As they pulled out of the parking lot and onto the open road, a single powerful column of steel and leather riding into the sunset, the last thing the people of the town saw was the small pewter wolf pin on Arthur's vest, catching the final brilliant gleam of the dying light.